After some technical difficulties, we are now recording the right screen. And so hopefully you paid attention to the first part because there was no recording of it. And it's now gone and lost forever. I know you're upset until, yeah, next time. Basically what we've done so far in a little bit of a lecture is kind of go through some JavaScript fundamentals and covered these different ways to create variable declarations and then covered data types in JavaScript. And what I was about to start covering is this Falsy Truthy concept. And I mentioned during break that this is used a lot. You're going to see this when we get to React. You're going to see this in Express and Node. Falsy and Truthy is used all over the place. And so definitely zone in for this portion. Okay, so what does this boil down to? Well, all of the values in JavaScript, so you can have a string value, a number value, it could be undefined or all these kinds of values. All the values that you can put into variables fall into one or two buckets. Okay, all the values fall into a Truthy bucket or a Falsy bucket. And then you can use a variable or a value, right, in an if statement and say, if this is Truthy, then do the truth block. If it's else, if it's Falsy, do the false block. Okay, so that's not the case in many other languages. There is no Truthy, obviously Truthy means kind of true. Kind of true. Right? Falsy means kind of false. Right? In other languages it's like, well, 5 is less than 6. True. There's no, that's Truthy. There is no Truthy. Right? But there is in JavaScript. So when it comes to Falsy, right, these are values that all evaluate to Falsy. Therefore, if put in an if statement, would run the else block instead of the true block. So, obviously we can kind of start with, we got a couple of functions, just kind of look at what we have here. This is all code from a prior recording. And let's just kind of clean it all up and kind of start with, right, just start with a function and calling that function. And then inside of that function, we're going to have an if statement. And if the condition is Truthy, it runs the Truthy block, else it runs the Falsy block. And I'll say let data equals, okay, so clearly, if I just do something like this, console log Truthy, true, G-R-U-T-H-Y. Isn't there an alcoholic beverage that's kind of sound, Truly? Okay, my bad. Moving on. Is Truly alcohol? It's a seltzer? Okay, so we can use a variable as what you might call a flag and say, hey, if this variable is evaluated to true, then you run Truthy, otherwise you run the Falsy block. And you can kind of start off by saying, hey, obviously a Boolean false value is considered Falsy. And if you kind of boot this up into the console and inspect the console, you would expect Falsy, and maybe just to be even a little bit more, Falsy block executed, Truthy block executed. Okay, so clearly a Boolean false is considered Falsy, and let's just kind of go through these. What else is considered a Falsy value? Well, 0. If the data is equal to 0. You're also going to get falsy block executed. Which is something to keep in mind as we're going to use these falsy blocks. Like here's an example where you might not want 0 to be falsy. Okay, here's one example where you might, a student can get a score on a test, and the valid scores are inclusive of 0 through 100. So 0 is a valid score. So if the score equals 0, you might assume, okay, you call this score. And if the score is good, you could save the score to the database for the student. Otherwise, you would say, please enter a valid score. Okay? So 0 is considered falsy. However, you might not always want that because 0 could be a valid score. And in this case, it's saying, please enter a valid score, but 0 is a valid score. So you might not want to use that as your flag, okay? So just keep that in mind, that 0 is considered falsy. However, you might not want that. Okay, 0, -0, okay. When you put the letter N here, it's just like saying this is a 0, like N is a number, so you're forcing the data type. Again, most of the time the interpreter is going to know the data type. Empty string is considered falsy. So let me kind of back up here and just kind of say empty string. We're going to use this a lot. Like, hey, if there's like data in there, then let's do something with the data. Otherwise, we're going to say, hey, okay, falsy block executed when you have an empty string. Again, this is kind of, we're going to be leveraged. We're going to leverage this, right? So what else is considered falsy? Null, undefined, and not a number. So if you can assign a value of null. Of course, null is considered falsy. I need to get everything all on one screen again here. I'm going to combine this screen and this screen into one. There we go. Okay, so now undefined. We know that an undefined variable looks something like this, right? So if it's undefined, we're getting falsy. And last but not least, not a number. We did an example of not a number yesterday. Yesterday we said score equals a string 12 times anything, and that's going to return not a number, and therefore not a number. You
added a letter in the string.
Aha, thank you. That's what we did yesterday. 12L times 8. Right, because it can multiply 12 times 8 here, but you do 12L times 8, there you go. That's not a number. Thank you, Tony. Good memory. Cool. So a lot of values that are considered falsy. What are considered truthy? Well, a Boolean true, of course, considered truthy. Positive and negative numbers, 123. Positive and negative numbers considered truthy. Negative 123 considered truthy. An array and an object considered truthy. So you just say, hey, we got an array, and the array can have data or not have data, right? So if you got an array, truthy block, or if you put 1, 2, 3 in there, that's also truthy. An object is also considered truthy, right? Whether there's data in there or not doesn't really matter. Arrays and objects are considered truthy, and then there you go. Okay, so cool. We've got truthy and falsy values, and I like it. You just got to understand it's one or two buckets. Right? It's a truthy bucket and a falsy bucket, and every value in JavaScript is going to be put into one of two buckets. The one that can be a little trippy is the 0. Did I mention there's a bunch of ways to loop in JavaScript? So let's loop through an array. And so let's talk about all the loops. And I'm just gonna rip right off the PowerPoint. While loop. 3 parts of all these loops. Part 1, you've got this variable called an iterator. You're going to iterate over the loop. Part 2, you have a test to determine if the loop continues. Part 3, you modify your iterator. Right? 3 parts of a loop. This is starting off at 0, looping while 0 is less than 3, 0, 1, 2, exit the loop. Console log the values. We go back here, we go cat, dog, unicorn. A do while. Now a while loop is considered a pre-test loop, so you're testing your condition before the body of the loop. A do while is different. A do while is a post-test loop. It still has the 3 parts. You have your iterator variable, you have your test, and you have the modification of the iterator variable. It's going to get the same results. Here, why are we adding this if statement before we're adding the do while? Well, if there is no length in the array, and you console log array sub 0, that's going to crash, right? So you're just doing a little error handling here, making sure that you're not crashing anything. Probably the most used is a standard for loop. Your for loop is considered a counted loop. It's beautiful because you get all 3 parts in one set of parentheses all at the beginning of the loop. It's my favorite loop. It is very common. You should know for loops by now. I trust that you know for loops by now. Cat, dog, unicorn. Okay. Here's the ones that are newer in JavaScript. Check out what I've got highlighted on my screen, please. We have the first one, which is called the for in loop, and we have the for of loop. Now, I realize what we're looping through is an array, okay? But I just want to point something out. When you go to Mozilla Developer Network, and you search for each, for in, not for of. Okay. Kind of looking at for of, for of is used looping through an array. Okay, so you got the keyword for, your iterator variable of your array. Okay? But notice there's also a for in. So this is for of on MDN. I'm going to go in for in MDN. Okay? And when you look at the example here, for in is used with objects. So along the way, I learned, and I believe this is still true, you want to use for in for objects, you want to use for of for arrays. And if you just go to the MDN docs, they show you the syntax. Okay, so here's your array, for of element of array 1, Kind of cool, of course, if you just in Visual Studio, you got for in and for of right here in your emmet. So as you're starting to type, you just type in the word for, and since we have an array, I'm going to use a for of for my array. The iterator is going to be called, iterator of ARR console.log iterator. Okay. Does everyone understand how this one works? A couple people shake their head. No one else looks. A couple people more shake their head when I make awkward silence. So you'll see both of these shorthand loops. Okay, iterator, the first time through the loop, iterator holds the value cat. The second time, iterator holds the value of dog. The third time, iterator holds the value of unicorn. Spit it out on the screen, and you get what you would expect. Now, we just did for of. Let's do a for in. See, for in is a little bit different. You can see it fills in a really interesting code snippet. Const key in object. Okay, let's do this. Let's do this. Remember, for in is used in objects. For in is used in objects. So when I do my code snippet, for in, it fills in a little object here. So that's actually pretty useful. Let's fill this in with an object, right? So here's our array we'll loop through. Const user equals first name so kind of looking here, you can see it's changing the properties, right? So it's changing the property each time through the loop. So the first property should be first name, the second property should be last name, and I can kind of short circuit that, and I could just say const key. Well, here A is your key and 1 is your value, right? These are key value pairs. That's why it uses the word key, right? So you could call this a property, you could call it a key. So if I do console log user sub key, it's going to loop through my keys and spit out inside of user. So we're going to loop through my keys inside of my user object, and it should spit out the values Evan and Gudmested, and there you go. And so that's your for in versus your for of. I gotta tell you, I go back to MDN all the time on these two particular loops because they're newer. They've been around, I say newer, but maybe since 2015 or whatever, so they're not so new anymore. But just having these, understanding the difference, one's used for arrays, one's used for objects, and the docs are your friends. Okay. Instead of hitting you guys with like a 4-hour theory day, I'm going to go ahead and stop right here. We'll pick some of this more theory up tomorrow. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording and then we'll talk about what we're going to do. Probably spent a lot of that time off of camera.